There we go. Okay, by way of background, there's a couple things I wanted to talk about briefly. One is what social scientists sometimes call the shifting baseline of perception. And it's essentially the idea that whatever we are used to or whatever our experience has been is normal. It was first described with marine fisheries where fishermen didn't really perceive that catches were going down or fish being caught were smaller because they had grown used to it. And if you apply it to rivers, if you've grown up in an urbanized area, you may not have any idea of what the potential of a particular river looks like in terms of its natural setting. You may just be used to something that's very simplified and restrained. So, of course, people's perception of rivers and floodplains becomes very important in their ideas about how rivers should be managed or their support for restoration. A second basic idea is that it matters where you are in the world. The environmental context process domain here, are you in a mountainous headwaters? Are you in a large lowland floodplain river in the Columbia Basin? Are you up in a small mountainous channel, or are you down on the main stem? Biome, are you in the tropics, the temperate zone? These basic physical and ecological settings make a difference in what a river can look like, again, in terms of its natural potential and the sources and types of spatial heterogeneity that you might expect to find. And then a third point, what is natural? It's a little bit easier in North America. A lot of people will say natural is prior to intensive resource use primarily by Europeans. Certainly Native Americans in parts of North America strongly influence river process and form, but for the most part, it starts with beaver trapping when Europeans came here. But a key part of trying to understand what is natural, of course, is that apart from our influences, rivers aren't static. There's a natural range of variability in disturbances like floods and droughts or wildfires, and an associated natural range of variability in flow regime, sediment and large wood entering the channel, and channel morphology. So it's very challenging to figure out what that natural range of variability is. A lot of times people will use reference conditions. They'll go to the least human altered type of river that they can find in a drainage basin or in a region. Even if there's no obvious human alteration at present, it's often important to understand the land use history, because there are places in Colorado, for example, where there hasn't been timber harvest in a century, but we found that there are still significant differences in the amount of large wood in the streams, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So basically, a big part of understanding what natural is trying to understand the natural water and sediment regimes in large wood coming into a channel network. So just to illustrate the shifting baseline of perception idea, this is the inside front cover of a textbook that was published in 1994 on river pollution. Haslam is a British riparian ecologist, so if you look at this and you say, yeah, that's a pretty bad river. What I found particularly interesting, though, was the opposing inside front cover, which is this. And it looks much nicer, much healthier than the polluted river on the right. But the more I looked at it, the more I thought, I'm not all that impressed by that. This is Britain, and Britain historically was completely forested. All of the famous moors and the Lake District, those are all anthropogenically created through controlled and repeated burning. So if you look at this drawing for a minute, it's very bucolic and pastoral, but it's not all that natural, given that this is supposed to be Britain. The channels are pretty uniform width. I don't see any evidence of bed forms. There's not much variation in the vegetation along the stream channel, etc. So we'll come back to that drawing at the end. But I think most people would look at that and say, oh yeah, that's a nice, natural, healthy river, as opposed to the drawing on the right, where it's very obviously not. So coming back to that idea of natural range of variability and the importance of environmental context, I tend to conceptualize river corridors, and I use that term to mean the active channel, the adjacent floodplain, and the underlying hypereic zone. I conceptualize river corridors as influenced by two primary categories. The first one is fluxes, and these are just hypothetical fluctuations through time in water in the blue line, sediment in the black line, and in forested regions, large wood in the brown. So those are what I sometimes think of as the physical tripod that supports river process and form, the inputs of those materials through time and space. Those inputs interact with what I've called context here, which is really the physical setting of the river corridor. So again, are you in the headwaters? Are you in a very spatially confined valley bottom, like the one on the left, which is the Colorado River in Grand Canyon, where Bright Angel tributary enters? Or are you in a wide, low gradient area with a huge floodplain? The example on the right is in the Yukon catchment in central Alaska. So what are the spatial limits for the channel to develop and for wood and sediment to move through the channel network? What's the boundary erosional resistance? That's going to really influence whether, for example, you have a meandering river, a straight river, a braided river. So it's just how erodible is the sediment itself, and if it's in a bedrock canyon, the bedrock substrate. Base level stability, I'm guessing everyone knows what base level is. It's that downstream point that governs channel incision or aggradation. So is that stable, or do you have nick points or waterfalls moving up through the network? And in the white box within the larger box, I've got valley geometry, which I think the connection to what I've just been saying is obvious. But I also have human influence, because we don't change valley geometry, but we change the way that the channel interacts with the valley geometry. And what I'm thinking of, for example, is levees or flow regulation, where you just don't have peak flow going across the floodplain, even if the floodplain is still present. So the context is both the natural context and how we've altered it. So the fluxes and the context result in a whole series of characteristics. And that first box with the whitish or light gray background is sort of the most generic or general terms. So how spatially heterogeneous is the channel? And one way to think about this is how much does it deviate from the most simple, straight, uniform channel? Think of an irrigation canal. How much is the natural channel different from that very simple endpoint? And the floodplain. Connectivity, you could think of this as 3 dimensions. The lateral between the channel and floodplain are uplands and river corridor, vertical with the atmosphere and the hypereic zone, and longitudinal in terms of material moving downstream. Resilience to disturbance, how much does the river corridor change in response to natural disturbances like floods or human alteration, and how quickly does it return to pre-disturbance conditions? Ecological integrity, I'm guessing most people are familiar with. It's a much more well-established term. Geomorphic integrity is a phrase that was first used by geographer Will about a decade ago, and he was talking about the ability of the river corridor to adjust to changes in those fluxes. So if you had a large flood, if the river corridor has geomorphic integrity, it can do what it would do naturally. The channel can widen, you can have erosion and deposition. If it's lacking geomorphic integrity, maybe it's got levees or bank stabilization or grade control, the floodwaters and that excess energy and sediment just gets passed downstream. There's no adjustment within the channel. And then the bottom row, specific examples, so gradient of the channel, plan form, how far overbank floods go, etc. And again, I think it's important to think of all of these things happening in a river corridor, not just the channel. And I realize people who think about rivers, that's a really obvious point, but all you have to do is look at our legal system, where waters of the U.S., whatever spatial extent they may apply to, do not apply to floodplains. We artificially separate surface water and groundwater, and we artificially separate channels and floodplains a lot in management and legislation. So at least as scientists thinking about rivers, I think it's really important to explicitly think about the river corridor. And to make that point more visual, this is a nice diagram from some work by Judd Harvey and Mike Gusev, where they were talking about river corridor science. This particular diagram is referring to exchanges of water and solutes, and it looks messy. And it is. In real rivers, there is that 3-dimensional connectivity. It changes over time and space. And I could have changed the color of the arrows and put sediment on here, or organic matter, or large wood, or organisms. You know, the point is there's a lot of exchanges between the active channel and the adjacent environments. And the way we tend to think about them is a very artificial separation and isolation of the channel. Okay, and another, I think, benefit of thinking about river corridors rather than just channels is it really can help to emphasize the connectivity between what's going on with fluxes of water, sediment, and dead wood, and then living biota and biogeochemistry. And for a long time, geomorphologists at least and hydrologists thought about this as a one-way thing. There's a physical template that's created and then the biota responds. And of course, we know that's not the case. You can think of riparian vegetation as an obvious example. As the vegetation grows, it strongly influences the erosional resistance of the channel boundaries. It influences water balance. It influences the distribution of hydraulic forces and the transport of sediment, just as one example. And of course, since I'm talking to an audience in the Pacific Northwest, I have to use large wood as a big example too. There's a strong two-way interaction. The physical configuration of the river corridor influences where wood is deposited and stored, but then once the wood is deposited and stored, it influences hydraulics and sediment movement and the physical process and form. So two-way street. I think thinking about river corridors also, again, just helps to very explicitly remember that there are at least three primary parts to a river corridor: the active channel, the floodplain, and the hyperetic zone. Okay, so coming back to spatial heterogeneity, or what I'm calling on this slide, physical complexity. What am I talking about? Well, the stream bed. And an example here, looking downstream, this is a mountain stream in Rocky Mountain National Park. Most of the length of the stream in the mountains is cobble to boulder bed. It's step pool and cascade channels. You see something very different here associated with the channel spanning logjam. So the backwater, you have spatial heterogeneity in hydraulics, in sediment transport, in flow depth, in substrate type, and habitat. So a variety of features can create heterogeneity in the stream bed. Deposition of sediment creating bars or secondary channels, and of course the associated variation in substrate, bed forms, large wood. You can also have variability in the banks. A very small scale example here. This is a subalpine meadow in southern Wyoming. You can see the small undulations in the bank in the foreground. There are a variety of things that can cause a channel to not have just a single or a simple straight bank with a uniform cross section. Large wood, living vegetation, big boulders, bedrock outcrops, etc. But wherever you have this variability, either on the very small scale as you're seeing here, or think about constrictions and expansions as you go through pools and riffles, that again creates spatial heterogeneity in hydraulics, in substrate, in nutrient retention, habitat, etc. Cross-sectional form, again, bed forms like pools and riffles or meander bends create variability in the cross-sectional area and the symmetry of that area. And certainly in plan form, looking down in a map view, how sinuous is the channel? Are there secondary channels? So is it an anastomosing or a braided network? Do you have a bunch of cutoff meanders as you do in this example? So sinuosity, number of channels, extent of floodplain wetlands. You can see some nice cutoff meanders forming persistent wetlands here. This is a small channel in interior Alaska. So when I think of spatial heterogeneity, I think of it in these four basic categories: bed and banks, cross-sectional form, and plan form, and they're all very tightly interconnected. What creates this? Well, fundamentally, it's those fluxes. So water, sediment, and large wood, and then what I've called biotic drivers here, just as a short phrase as a non-biologist. What I'm thinking of, living riparian vegetation. In your part of the world, salmon, of course, creating spatial heterogeneity in the bed through constructing redds. In any forested region, large wood is a big one. And in the Northern Hemisphere, beaver are a very important biotic driver in creating spatial heterogeneity in small rivers or secondary channels on floodplains. All of those processes are associated with erosion and deposition of sediment. And if that is not homogeneous in space, as it never is, then that's a source of physical complexity. And that's primarily in river corridors associated with lateral channel movement, or within the channel, if it's not very laterally mobile, those spatial and temporal changes in things like bed forms and the substrate characteristics, the cross-sectional geometry and the plan form. So, okay, natural rivers are as I had in the title, messy or spatially heterogeneous. They're not perfectly sign-generated meandering curves with uniform width. So what? Well, A big one is habitat abundance and diversity. And this, I now have a GoPro, but this was an earlier iteration. I just stuck the camera under the water and took a picture and hoped for the best. And I've got a trout in the background there. RMNP is Rocky Mountain National Park. The big white arrow indicates flow direction. This is the backwater above a channel spanning logjam. And if you see the very large boulders on the bed in the foreground, that's what much of this channel looks like. But wherever there's a channel spanning logjam, you have a nice backwater with, you can see the finer substrate and the organic matter in the foreground. The dark mass at the back is a very large boulder that the flow is plunging over. So you can see some of the bubbles coming in the middle background. And the water surface, which is at the top of this photo, is very silvery because of all the bubbles on it. But point is, if you have more spatial heterogeneity, you are certainly increasing the habitat diversity, and you may be increasing the abundance as well. And here it's just showing a very different type of habitat than you get elsewhere along this channel in the absence of channel spanning logjams. You can also strongly influence both the resistance or the lack of change in response to disturbance and the resilience or the ability to recover to both natural and human disturbances. And I've listed 3 of the big ones here: fire, flood, drought in the short term. Over the longer term, ongoing climate change and all the things we do, like taking water out of channels, at least in my part of the world, or changing the flow regime for hydroelectric power, for example, in your part of the world. So an example of this, this is a beaver modified ecosystem. It's a beaver meadow in Rocky Mountain National Park along North St. Vrain Creek. The upper photo is an overview. It was taken in autumn, so the willows are brown. There's very dense willow thickets there that you can see in the lower photo, but you can see areas of standing water, multiple channels. The lower photo is just on the ground in early June, and there's 3 channels coming together there. So it's an anastomosing channel planform through here. That has a very high riparian water table. It's got a very high connectivity between the channel and the floodplain, and between the valley bottom and the hyporheic zone. And of course, with all the dense riparian willows, when you do have a large flow, it spreads out across the valley bottom, and you have a huge amount of attenuation of everything moving downstream. So nutrients, sediment, water, organic matter. And this was really brought home to me. I've been working in this particular site for about a decade. We had a very large flood in Colorado in 2013, and I could hardly wait to get up here and see what had happened. And first, all the roads were knocked out, and then the government shut down, so the park was officially closed. But when I did finally get up there, about 3 weeks after the flood, there was no evidence of the flood. I had to really poke around under the willows at the upstream end to see some sediment deposits and some new large wood. But compared to what happened in the narrow, steep portions of this catchment where there were extensive debris flows and a lot of change in response to the flood, it was pretty amazing to see how resilient this section was. And compare that to Moraine Park, which is the next major catchment to the north in the national park. Moraine Park, as late as the 1970s, looked like the site I was just showing you, but the beaver have largely disappeared, mainly because of very high elk population densities and overgrazing. So as the beaver dams have disappeared, the riparian water table has dropped, and it's mostly reverted to 1 or at most 2 channels that are active in this valley bottom now. So it's a similar scenario to what you may be familiar with Yellowstone National Park, except we haven't gotten our wolves back yet. But in October 2011, some folks up this canyon that you're looking up had an illegal open campfire at a place called Fern Lake. It spread into the old growth that's up this canyon and spread into the riparian area and burned it. And when I saw it, I thought that would not have burned if you had that high riparian water table, if the beaver were still present, creating that spatial heterogeneity and resilience. And this is the most dramatic example I know. Joe Wheaton at Utah State gave me this. It's a site in Idaho. This is right after a fire, and that green part of the valley has the spatial heterogeneity and the high riparian water table associated with active beaver dams. So it didn't burn and everything else did. So really dramatic example of resilience. A third implication, how much the river corridor retains everything moving downstream. So how much attenuation do you have of peak flow, how much storage of sediment, how much biological uptake of nutrients, how much storage of contaminants if they're adsorbed to sediment. And what you're looking at here is a very small channel in Rocky Mountain National Park. It's about 2.5 meters wide. There's a logjam here. That logjam probably blows out every couple of years, but while it's present, you can see, again, sand, a lot of organic matter that's stored there. This is a very steep step pool channel that's mostly boulder bed. And what microbial ecologists have shown is that if you can retain particulate organic matter for even a few hours, that starts the process of biological uptake. So you've got biofilms or microbial communities, macroinvertebrates that can start to process it. So you don't have to necessarily retain it for hundreds or thousands of years. Even a very short time frame can increase biological uptake. And of course, if you have the heterogeneity associated with this logjam, you've also got a pressure gradient. So you're increasing hypereic exchange. And I'm sorry, I'm assuming everyone knows what hypereic is. It's the portion of water immediately below the channel. So it's subsurface water, but it originates in the channel, flows in the subsurface for some distance, and then returns to the channel. So it's sourced and returned to surface flow. There are microbial communities in the hypereic zone that are particularly important in denitrification, for example. So even if you have a fairly transient source of spatial heterogeneity like this logjam, and you're increasing that hypereic exchange, you can increase the biological availability of some of those nutrients. So you can disperse material if it's being deposited on the floodplain. You can dilute it if it's being stored or attenuated. The more spatial heterogeneity you have in the river corridor, the greater the retention. Another one, connectivity. And spatial heterogeneity can either increase or decrease connectivity. It depends on what the source of heterogeneity is. So this is on the west side of Rocky Mountain National Park. What you're seeing in the lower right, what looks like a pile of sticks there, is an old beaver lodge. When the beaver were present here, and again, here they're gone now, in this case because of moose competition for riparian vegetation. But when the beaver were present and their dams were there, there would have been less longitudinal connectivity, but there would have been more lateral and vertical connectivity. So more connectivity between the channel and the floodplain and between the channel and the hypereic zone. So again, it's the details of what the source of physical complexity is make a difference, but it affects different dimensions of connectivity. Okay, so with that by way of background, I'm just going to give a brief example from the mountains here in the Southern Rockies, but of course everything I'm saying would apply to mountain streams anywhere, including in the upper Columbia and at the very general level to any type of river. So what I'm referring to as a metamorphosis here is that I've seen as a result of human activity, we've gone from more spatially heterogeneous channels to much more homogeneous and uniform channels. And it's driven in the forested parts of the mountains by two primary things, large wood and beavers. And both of those have become much less common in different parts of the Southern Rockies for different reasons. So, but just look at logjams as an example. If you have a tree that falls into a channel, of course there are different scenarios of what can happen, but if the tree forms a ramp, which means that one portion, typically the root wad or the lower trunk, is above the high flow level. So it's resting on the bank, maybe it's still attached by the root wad. That piece is much less mobile. So it forms an obstruction and it's likely to trap other smaller, more mobile pieces and create a logjam. And in the small to medium channels that I'm looking at, which are mostly 30 meters across or less, that's very likely to become a channel spanning logjam. But the effects of that logjam depend very much on that environmental context. So I think of it as a threshold based on valley geometry. If you're on one side of the threshold, you're in a steep, narrow valley. The site you're looking at in the lower left there burned in 1978, but it's right by timberline, so it's slow regrowth. You can see there's a channel spanning logjam there, and you can see the backwater. It's local. It only goes a few meters upstream because it's a pretty steep channel. It's simple because you form a backwater, which is important, but it's not really doing anything for the floodplain because there essentially is no floodplain. The channel is as wide as the valley bottom. And it's transient because when we do have a large flood, like the 2013 flood that I talked about, that logjam is probably going to blow out. There's a lot of hydraulic force that would be exerted against it, and it's all concentrated on the logjam. So this coming summer will be the final year of a decade-long study where I've been surveying a population of about 400 logjams in Rocky Mountain National Park, and I found that the logjams in these areas are much more transient. They only last a couple of years. The new ones form, so the net number doesn't necessarily change through time, but they are coming and going. On the other side of the threshold, it's a very different scenario. So you can see the photo that you saw earlier. That's a wide, low gradient valley bottom. So you form that channel spanning logjam. First of all, the backwater extends farther upstream because it's a more gentle gradient in the channel. Secondly, because the channel has a floodplain, the floodplain essentially acts like a safety valve during large floods. So you get more overbank flow, you're more likely to have bank erosion and the formation of secondary channels you can go to in an anastomosing planform. Because the material is more erodible than in that lower photo where it's essentially bedrock right next to the channel. If you're forming more channels, there's more opportunity for wood recruitment through bank erosion. So you end up with this fairly spatially extensive and very complex river corridor, and it's more persistent because that floodplain acts as a safety valve during peak flows. The floodwaters spread across the floodplain, they dissipate a lot of hydraulic energy. So the jams in these reaches do change, but they tend to be more persistent than those in the steep, narrow segments of the valley bottom. So you have this, the gray circle at the top is supposed to indicate this self-enhancing feedback where once you form a logjam initially, you have the potential to form many more logjams through those secondary channels. So this is an example on a reach scale where that environmental context makes a big difference in how the river corridor responds to a very simple disturbance, in this case, a single tree falling. But the key is that that tree falling, wherever it falls, it does create more spatial heterogeneity, but in the upper scenario, it really can lead to this feedback that results in a much more resilient river corridor. We had a multidisciplinary study up in these channels that finished a couple of years ago, and we found much more biodiversity and biomass in terms of predators of aquatic insects, fish, and riparian spiders were the things we were looking at, and much higher organic carbon stock in terms of floodplain soils and large wood. So there's a series of secondary effects from this initial disturbance and the resulting spatial heterogeneity. Okay, so what do I mean by healthy? I've defined what I mean by messy. It's spatial heterogeneity. Healthy is not a term that scientists tend to like because it's hard to define, and we don't all agree from different disciplines on how to define it, but it is a term that has a lot of resonance with the public. A healthy river sounds good. You can sort of draw analogies to human health. So I'm looking at healthy in a couple of different examples in this talk. First one is organic carbon storage. So you're sequestering carbon in the watershed rather than taking it downstream in dissolved organic carbon or particulate. And this is started with Nick Sutphin's PhD work. And I'm just briefly summarizing it here. What we found, we knew that those wide, low gradient valley bottoms that have high riparian water tables and a lot of spatial heterogeneity would store more carbon, but I was really surprised at how much more they store. Those this is in Rocky Mountain National Park, those wide low gradient reaches are only about a quarter of the total river length in the mountain streams, but they have about 3/4 of the carbon that's present in the valley bottom. And the valley bottoms, or the river corridors themselves, are only less than 1% of the whole watershed area. But the soil organic carbon, the amount of downwood, and the living biomass is much higher than in the uplands. So it's almost a quarter of the total carbon at the watershed scale, which, if you're thinking about this is the bad thing about giving this talk this way. I can't see your faces and get any visual feedback, but one immediate implication is if you want to sequester carbon, it's great to do reforestation and things like the REDD or RED program, but start thinking about the wetlands in the valley bottom because you can get a lot of carbon in per unit area in those portions of the river network that have wet riparian soils and wetlands. Okay, a second line of evidence, just how complex is the channel and what does it mean in terms of, again, that things like biomass and biodiversity. And this, Bridget Livers was the PhD student who was doing the geomorphology portion of this. We found there was much greater physical channel complexity and more organic matter and organic carbon stored in portions of these river networks where we had old growth forest. And I don't want you all to laugh at me, but our old growth trees get up to 1 meter in diameter, which is pretty impressive compared to, look at what's Bridget's feet. The younger forest is 20 to 30 centimeters diameter. So it's not the Pacific Northwest, but for our area, those big trees are still less mobile and very important, and they really are key to jumpstarting a lot of this spatial heterogeneity. And what our colleagues working on the project found was that they were looking at stream metabolism, particularly nitrogen, which is nitrate, is a real serious source of atmospheric contamination in the rivers in Rocky Mountain National Park. You get more nutrient uptake where you have that greater channel complexity and spatial heterogeneity. If nothing else, it equates to more length of channel per length of valley bottom if you have multiple channels that are parallel to one another and branching and rejoining. And of course, you also get much more hypereic exchange with those log jams. And again, that equated to much greater biomass for both fish and riparian spiders, the predators. We didn't see more insects, and our ecologist colleagues interpreted that to mean that they were getting eaten. They did look at emergence, and there were more of them coming out, but the predators were happy. So there was a lot of predator biomass. Okay, so putting this in a longer term and larger perspective, the Front Range has had a long history of timber harvest. There's very little timber harvest now, but when gold was discovered in 1859, there was widespread deforestation, so there's not a lot of old growth left. And of course, this is closely parallels what we see globally. Humans have reduced forest cover by half, and old growth is almost entirely gone. One of the things that I see in relation to this is my version of alternative states, my version that it's an idea that comes from ecology, and I took very simplistic terms to describe it. With respect to log jams, wood rich and wood poor. The idea behind wood rich is that if you don't take the wood out of the stream, the amount of wood that's being recruited, transported, and stored varies through time and space as a result of natural fluctuations. We have fires, we have blowdowns, we have insect infestations, we have floods, etc. But wood decays very slowly in stream corridors in the temperate zone, so there's always some wood present. And as long as there's some wood present, it's very effective at trapping other wood. So you can create and maintain these big channel-spanning log jams like the one you see on the left. If you take all the wood out, as happened in many places historically for a variety of reasons, even if the forest regrows, as you see in the photo on the right, you can see the tree leaning over there, but if it falls in, it's much less likely to be trapped and retained than it is in the scenario on the left. So Brian Collins and others have shown this very nicely for the Puget Lowlands. If you pull all the wood out, you go to a very different channel and floodplain configuration that are pretty persistent and stable. It takes a long time to recover. One of the things we found in the project that Bridget looked at was we compared both old growth with younger forest, but the younger forest was either naturally disturbed or had a history of timber harvest. Now, that timber harvest occurred more than a century ago, and there's been no human disturbance since then, but we've still found statistically significant differences in spatial heterogeneity, retention, and biomass and biodiversity in those channels between the 100-year-old naturally disturbed and the 100-year-old human disturbed. And I think it's because when they did the timber harvest, they pulled all the wood out of the channels. So again, there's a long recovery time. And of course, I'm guessing that many of you have heard of beaver meadows versus elk grasslands. A similar scenario for a very spatially heterogeneous, wet riparian valley bottom that's maintained by the presence of beavers versus that dry, almost xeric, well, it is xeric grassland, where the beaver dams disappear when the beavers disappear and the channel incisors and the water table drops. Okay, so playing on that ridiculous movie Dumb and Dumber, how messy or how spatially heterogeneous should the river corridor be? Well, it depends a lot on where you are in the drainage basin, where you are in the world, and the potential or the possibilities are constrained by land use history. If it takes more than a century, and there are studies from other parts of the world showing this as well, if it takes more than a century to restore the level of wood and the associated complexity that goes with old growth forest, then even if there's no land use right now, the spatial heterogeneity or messiness is going to depend on what happened there in the past. And just 3 randomly chosen sites from around the world. The sources of spatial heterogeneity in the headwater channel in Borneo here are going to be very different than those in the headwater channel in Colorado that's in the upper right. But both of them have natural processes that create and maintain that spatial heterogeneity. And I think a lot of what we can usefully focus on in understanding and managing river corridors is trying to understand what those sources of spatial heterogeneity are and what the implications are. So one way to think about this, you can look at length scale and time scales. There are components of spatial heterogeneity, or just river characteristics, that change constantly over short time and space scales. Think about, if you look at the lower left of this diagram, dunes and ripples in a sand bed stream. They change all the time. You go to the upper right, there are things that we as humans really don't affect, like profile concavity, profile gradient, the sort of basin scale variables. Those are really controlled by climate and tectonics. A lot of what we affect is at these small to intermediate scales, both in terms of what we do throughout the whole watershed, like land use and land cover, but also within the river corridor itself through things like flow regulations, channelization, channel bank stabilization, et cetera. And I think it's important to remember that a lot of what we do, particularly at the watershed scale, like land use and land cover, at least in the past, nobody was thinking about how that would affect streams, but it does have these persistent legacy effects that constrain spatial heterogeneity and geomorphic and ecological integrity today. So much of what we've done has been to reduce that physical complexity and spatial heterogeneity. Okay, so where do we go forward? I am a field scientist and I rely a lot on empirical data and field observations, but I think we really have to start developing numerical models, or continue to develop numerical models that get at some of the processes I've been talking about. We've come a long way in coupling hydraulics and sediment transport. It's very routine to use 2-dimensional models, and in many cases 3-dimensional models of that are reasonably accurate. There aren't many models that include large wood. The ones that I'm aware of are mostly coming from Europe, from work in the Alps, but there are some pretty rapid advances being made in those. But then taking that to the next level and saying, all right, so what does it matter what happens to the wood in terms of transport and deposition or storage? How does that influence spatial heterogeneity? How does that influence 3-dimensional fluxes of a variety of material? I used organic carbon stock and biomass as examples, but how does that influence some of these response variables? And I put it as a feedback loop because ideally we keep using field observations and direct manipulation through things like river restoration and management to calibrate and inform those models. So I want to just end by saying that hopefully, as if you may already have been thinking this way, but this talk will help you to look at a scene like this, which is a headwater channel in Glacier National Park in Montana, and think very explicitly about those fluxes and the connectivity that is facilitating or retarding those fluxes. Think about some of the implications like organic carbon stocks, biomass and biodiversity, and think of them as occurring in this context of a river corridor rather than just the active channel. So coming back to this drawing, I asked one of our former grad students, Maisie Richards, who was at the meeting in January, to sort of reimagine the boy with the dog, and I'm not sure what happened to the dog, but the boy's catching a fish now, and Maisie put in some of the things that I would expect to see along a river in England. And so there's the brown splotch is large wood, the green is woody riparian vegetation of different ages, the slightly darker blue is a secondary channel cut across the point bar, the pale blue in the middle of the channel, there's ripples and pools. The yellow blotch, there's more diversity in that varial zone or the riparian edge. And I think if we can encourage people to think about river corridors as being naturally more functional in a condition that we might perceive as messy or unattractive, that will help a lot with how we both conceptualize and communicate both management and specifically restoration of river corridors. And these are 3 papers that I just put on in the upper right that talk about perceptions of how people don't like large wood. The Pacific Northwest is the exception. Certainly in my part of the world, large wood is a hazard. It's something to get rid of, not something you want to sustain or encourage. This is general societal perceptions. And the Lillet et al. Paper is talking about how people think braided rivers are unsightly and unhealthy. And an example of changing those perceptions, this is a channel in Italy. You can see it in 2005 on the left. The white lines across the channel are grade control. There was a lot of bank stabilization there. You can see the historic floodplain has towns on it, agricultural fields, playing fields at the left. The local community, or the local governing body, got EU funding to do the restoration project, and the photo in 2010 is right after the restoration was complete. A lot of the gravel bars that you see here are now being taken over by riparian vegetation, primarily willows. The braided river on the right is much more representative of what this river would be like under natural conditions. It's not reoccupying the full floodplain, but there's more lateral connectivity than there was in 2005. And this project was, there was a lot of local resistance. Many of the local communities were very afraid it was going to increase the flood hazard, and they didn't think it would just increase the attractiveness of the river corridor. I had the chance to visit this site in 2018, and it was November. It was miserable. It was in the 30, 40 degree range. It was drizzling. It was a weekday, and there were so many people out. There were bird watchers. There were people exercising, walking their dogs. There's been a complete turnaround. This won an EU project for river restoration, and now it's very popular, and people are very proud in the adjacent communities of what was done here. So it gives me hope that we can get people to perceive rivers differently than we have in the recent past. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ellen. That was excellent. Yeah, you can applaud.
Yay!
That was very well done, and I think we could all listen to another hour of your research. And at this time, I'll just open it up first to the group in here in the conference room, if you have any questions, and then I'll turn it over to the people on the phone, so we kind of keep it somewhat organized. So any questions from folks here in the room?
I had a question.
Yes.
Ellen, great talk. Thanks for sharing. It seems like a lot of, especially what this group might be interested with this type of restoration, is that if you raise the riparian, you add the complexity, you raise the riparian water table, and that water is then released, and you get more flow. In the summer, cooler water, which is a good thing for salmon often. But the one thing I think about too is that if you have that will change the vegetation. We get more groundwater adapted vegetation like cottonwood, which can typically ET more water from that, local area. So has there been any observational studies looking at that, the kind of water budget of, okay, so you get more water in the groundwater if you have more channel complexity, but you also have vegetation that use more water. So I was just curious if you've heard of any or seen any observational studies.
No, that's a very good question, and it's a very important issue, particularly in my part of the West, the semi-arid. We're not really doing stage 0 restoration, as it's called in the Pacific Northwest, but there's a lot of beaver dam analogs being put in and beaver reintroduction going on. So that has become a concern. Are we having net loss of water because of increased evaporation and transpiration? The unfortunate thing that I can say is I don't know how much is being lost. I don't know of any studies that have done this, because if you're going to really do it well, it's not simple. You need the towers, the flux towers, fairly expensive equipment. The closest thing I know of, I was involved with Tim Cavino and Pam Wegner. Was a water resources research paper that was published in, I should know this off the top of my head, it was either 2017 or 2018. What we did was instrument stream flow in a steep, narrow reach, and then in the beaver meadow downstream from it. And it's the beaver meadow that I showed the photos of. And we found that there was that sponge effect. So the peak flow was attenuated, the base flow was increased downstream from beaver meadow. The Pam also looked at at carbon and nitrogen, and there it was just a sink. The beaver meadow absorbed what came in. And by comparison, the reach without a beaver meadow just transmitted the flood peak and the solutes. So yes, for sure, you would have some water loss because of evaporation and transpiration. I think it would depend a lot on how much and what type of riparian vegetation you had coming in because of the beaver and what the ponded area of water is. But I don't know of any studies that have done a complete water balance for a beaver modified valley bottom. Actually, I'll just add one other thing. Because this is a concern here, particularly by downstream water users, Colorado is getting ready to adopt standards that have been developed by Wyoming and Utah. And as I understand it, the argument goes, yes, we are impacting water availability for downstream water users with reserved water rights. But if you can demonstrate that you are returning the valley bottom to something that was present prior to European settlement, that's one leg to stand on. The second leg is that they are coming up with criteria. If the impounded water area created by the beavers is less than a certain surface area, it's allowable. Unfortunately, off the top of my head, I don't know what that area is. But I think that's what Colorado is about to go to. And, you know, I understand that the eastern part of Washington and Oregon, in particular, consumptive water use is a big concern as well.
Yep. Any other questions in the room here?
I have, this is Greer. I have a quick question for you, Ellen. So have you had anyone look at fire resiliency on the landscape? I'm kind of fascinated by the effect you might have on fire resiliency, losing a lot of these riparian and wetland areas. Has anyone looked at scenarios of, you know, what it maybe looked like historically and how that's changed because of the loss of these habitats?
Joe Wheaton, whose photo I showed earlier, is working on that. The other person I'm aware of who's working on it is, boy, here we go. I just had a brain hiccup and I'm drawing a blank on her name. She is at University of California, Channel Islands. She has a couple things online on YouTube that are quite nice. And her dissertation was at University of Colorado. She looked at sorry, if you take my screen off so people can't see what I'm doing, I can look in my email. I can find her name. Just escape here. And I will tell you in a moment. It's really annoying. I can't remember her name. So she did an analysis of using NDVI data to estimate the changes in wetland extent pre and post beaver in a large part of the southern Rockies. This is really annoying. Okay, I'm going to look her up online. I bet I can find her that way. So if anybody else has another question, I'll look this up while I'm trying to find this woman's name.
That sounds good.
So anyone on the phone have a question for Ellen? Wow, usually they all ask the same question at the same time, right?
Okay, sorry, I got it. Emily Fairfax, F-A-I-R-F-A-X, and she's at University of California, Channel Islands.
Great, thanks.
That's it. I mean, I've had people ask me this before. It's like, yeah, that would be an obvious thing to do, but not yet, other than Emily's work, and that was her dissertation work.
Excellent, thank you. Any other questions from folks on the phone?
Yeah, this is Brandon. Ellen, you talked a little bit about this, but did you see correlation between the size of the large weight debris in the jams you were watching and the persistence, and the correlation between size and persistence, or were you even looking at that at all?
I'm sorry, I had a huge amount of feedback. Could you say that again? I couldn't understand it.
Yeah. Did you see any correlation between the size of the large weight debris in the jams you were looking at and the persistence of those jams?
Oh, yeah, thanks. Okay, I heard it that time. Yeah, there are two parts to this. The persistence, again, it depends a lot on valley geometry, but the larger wood, mainly because it forms ramps or bridges, is more persistent. And one of the empirical thresholds that we found that the total amount of wood stored in the channel or channels correlates very strongly with the average downstream spacing for those ramp or bridge pieces. So for the channels we were looking at specifically, if they were spaced more closely than 20 meters, there was a huge increase in the amount of wood and the spatial heterogeneity and retention in the channel.
Thank you.
And I just want to respond to Greer's question. When I put in Emily's name, I came up with a NASA Landsat Science webpage, and it says Smokey the Beaver, ? Beaver dams and wildfire. So this is talking about what she's done, looking at, and she's got an NDVI plot down here, a beaver dam creek and in relation to wildfire. Greer, if you want, I can send you the web address, and then you can send it on to others who are listening in.
Yeah, now that you mentioned her name, I think we all have seen her most recent YouTube video of the beaver dam being built. So that's so funny. It's the same person. Yeah, thank you.
Other questions?
I have a comment. This is Alexa Whipple from the Met Beaver Project. Ellen, thank you for your talk, but I did want to let everyone know that there is research being done on beaver and fire connection. Currently, there's a student who will have his thesis done in June who is looking at the ability of beaver complexes to mitigate wildfire impact, specifically looking at soil and vegetation or fuels moistures in beaver complexes compared to areas that do not have beaver complexes. And my research, which will be published eventually, is on the recovery of streams after wildfire with beaver and without, and showing a tremendous speeding up of stream evolution processes with beaver in the system after wildfire.
That's great. Where's he at, Alexa? And what's his name?
His name is Joe Wyrick, so similar to Joe Wheaton, but he's at Eastern Washington University, and he worked on my study a little bit and got so inspired by it that he followed suit with sort of the prevention side, whereas I looked at the recovery side. And Seattle City Light actually funded his master's research, and so he'll be publishing that hopefully within a year. But anyone can reach out to the Met Beaver Project, and I can get you my thesis to look at for recovery. And then once his is out, I'd be happy to share his, as would he, on resistance to wildfire.
That's great, thanks. And I would mention one other thing. There is a paper, I'm looking at it right now, that was published in 2008 in Biological Conservation on how beaver wetlands mitigate the effects of drought. This is in boreal wetlands in Western Canada, and the two authors are Hood and Bailey, B-A-Y-L-E-Y. And anybody listening to this, if you can't find these things and you want to, you can either email me or I guess email Greer, and then Greer, I could send you stuff and you could send it to everybody, however you want to handle it.
Yeah, that'd be great. Anything you think would be useful, I can get out to the region.
Okay.
Other questions? Well, Ellen, thank you very much for taking the time to share this with us. We're sorry you weren't able to make it to the science conference. It's actually too bad because several of us would like to meet you, and you'd probably be mobbed right after your presentation. But thank you so much for sharing this with us. It was a great presentation. And I'm not sure, but I'm guessing the Upper Columbia Salmon Recovery Board will probably put your presentation on the website. So some of the folks that maybe could not call in and listen to this, they can actually go on the website. We've recorded it, so they can walk and go through the presentation. So thank you so much for that.
My pleasure. And I'm sorry I missed the ground meeting too, but I'm glad we could do this.
Hey, Tracy.
Yeah. Well,
Hi.
Yes.
Hi there. This is Keith Dublonica in the Governor's Salmon Recovery Office in Olympia, and it was a great presentation. My question is, we are going to be hosting a salmon recovery conference next April of 2021 in Vancouver, Washington, and we'll be putting sessions together over the next few months. But I think if you had the opportunity to come out, we'd love to have you present this presentation to that crowd. Usually we get 700 to 800 folks, and would be happy to stay in touch with you regarding that.
Thank you. I do have one question for you. How hard is it for little planes to land in the airport? I don't know if you heard the story, but I was in the airspace over Wenatchee. I could actually see the ground, but then the plane climbed again, and about 10 minutes later, the pilot said, "No, we can't land." But yeah, I mean, seriously, we can stay in touch about that.
Yeah, well, you're coming out of Denver, correct?
Yes, I know I can probably fly directly to Vancouver.
Well,
yeah.
PDX,
Okay.
Portland would be the site, and these are international airports.
Yeah, no, I've been in and out of Portland a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot better. Excellent. But thank you so much. Great presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Yep. Any other questions or comments for Ellen? All right. Thanks again, Ellen. You're welcome to hang with us for the rest of the meeting, or you can go off and instruct students on geomorphology and fluxes and fun things like that.
Okay. Yeah, I think I'll exit at this point, but thank you. Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.